Well, the pardons are back in the news, which is good. Trump has pardoned the J6 besiegers, and I wanted to share a chapter in my book, Chapter 3, about the pardons, because I think it's a relevant time to talk about this. This is called Justice Undone, an End Run Around the Judicial Process. As a criminal, Trump is most comfortable in the presence of other criminals. Other than when he was joking around with corrupt Russian diplomats in the Oval Office, has he ever looked as happy as he appeared in that video where he's with Jeffrey Epstein dancing? Even as the GOP nominee for president in 2016, his inner circle was honeycombed with sketchy characters. Mike Flynn, his disgraced former national security advisor, is a felon. He was convicted of lying to the FBI, and he was a key figure in the lead-in to J6. Michael Cohen, his personal attorney, was convicted of tax evasion and campaign finance violations related to the Stormy Daniels imbroglio. Paul Manafort, chair of the Trump campaign from June through August 2016, prime treason season, was indicted for conspiracy against the United States, money laundering, FARA violations, and a host of other charges. He was convicted and spent 23 months in prison. Roger Stone, Trump's longtime chum and political advisor, was indicted on 5 counts of false statements, 1 count of witness tampering, and 1 count of obstructing an official proceeding. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 months in federal prison. Stephen K. Bannon, who ran the Trump campaign after Manafort's departure and was even on the national security team for a minute, was indicted for wire fraud and money laundering. He was indicted again this past year, 2024, for obstruction of Congress and was convicted. He was sentenced to jail time, but as of this writing has yet to be ordered to the Huskow. Actually, he went to jail. So there. George Papadopoulos, one of Trump's foreign policy advisors, was convicted of making false statements to the FBI. His drunken gossip is what led the FBI to open its investigation into Trump's ties to Russia. He served 12 days in federal prison. Tom Barrack, longtime Trump crony and one of his money men, was indicted for acting as an unregistered agent for the UAE. He was acquitted. Tom Barrack acquitted. And Rudy Giuliani, whose father did time in Sing Sing for sticking up a milkman, really, and later worked as a mob enforcer. Rudy was allegedly involved in the extortion of Ukraine's President Zelensky, was a leader of the movement to illegally overturn the 2020 election, and on January 6, 2021, demanded trial by combat. That's a quote. He was indicted in elections cases in Georgia and Arizona. According to a lawsuit filed against him by a former employee, Noel Dunphy, he's a serial sexual assailant, an allegation that rings true to anyone who saw the second Borat movie. Now, that's a lot of shady characters to be associated with, and that is far from a comprehensive list of shady characters. I haven't mentioned Alan Weisselberg, the longtime CFO of the Trump Organization, who pleaded guilty to 15 felony counts of tax evasion, or Junior Eric and Ivanka, or Kellyanne Conway's grandfather, or Matt Gaetz, or Jim Jordan, or Eric Prince, or Eddie Gallagher, or Ghislaine Maxwell. I did mention Jeffrey Epstein, but still, Jeffrey Epstein. On and on it goes to infinity, a Mobius strip of mountebanks and scoundrels. To state the obvious, people don't associate with so many criminals who are not criminals themselves. As president, Trump had a singular way of ensuring the loyalty of his crooked associates. He could make their rap sheets disappear. And he's done it again this week, right, with the J6 people. So, moving on. Unlike most other powers granted to the president by the Constitution, the power to grant executive clemency is virtually unchecked. Some have argued that because the power to grant clemency is unlimited, Congress has no oversight role over grants of executive clemency. The opposite is true. Because the president can grant clemency to whoever he wants, for whatever reasons, it is critically important that certain grants of clemency be subject to congressional and public scrutiny. If the scrutiny were not applied to grants of clemency, the power could easily be abused, as we have seen. If the preceding paragraph doesn't sound like my voice, it's because someone else wrote it. Dan Burton, then the chair of the House Committee on Government Reform, and his team. Burton, a Republican, is a former representative from the 5th District of Indiana. That excerpt is from a lengthy report sent to House Speaker Dennis Hastert on May 14, 2001, entitled Justice Undone, Clemency Decisions in the Clinton White House, and concerns President Clinton, on his last day in office, granting a pardon to uber-wealthy financiers and longtime international fugitives Marc Rich and Pinky Green. The pair were indicted on September 19, 1983, on a whopping 65 counts related to tax evasion, mail fraud, racketeering, defrauding the government, and trading with the enemy. This is what the New York Times had to say at the time. Marc Rich, one of the world's leading commodity traders, was indicted yesterday by a federal grand jury on charges that he and a partner had evaded $48 million in income taxes. Prosecutors said it was the biggest tax fraud indictment in history. The two men were also accused of buying oil from Iran after trade with that nation had been declared illegal in response to the November 4th, 1979 seizure of American hostages. Mr. Rich, a reclusive multimillionaire, and his partner, Pinky Green, were charged with 51 counts of tax evasion, racketeering, and fraud. Through a spokesman, both men declared themselves innocent. End of quote. As soon as he got wind of the prosecution, Rich turned tail and fled the country, holing up in Switzerland, a country with a notoriously lax attitude towards foreign tax collection that he knew would not extradite him. He spent 17 years on the lam, evading numerous attempts at arrest, which is no doubt easier to manage if you have hundreds of millions of dollars to throw at the problem. Marc Rich was the prototype for an emerging strain of white-collar criminal that Americans 4 decades later know too well. He was amoral, willing to do business with anyone and everyone with the means to engage his services, no matter how despicable: mobsters, despots, drug traffickers, arms dealers, oligarchs, ayatollahs. He had no national loyalty. Born in Belgium, but a U.S. citizen, he was all too happy to renounce at the first whiff of trouble citizenship of the country that took him in during the war. He played the intelligence services of other countries to curry favor with the nation that issued his passport. And, oh yeah, it was his audacious cheating on his taxes, which is screwing over the rest of us, that got him in trouble in the first place. We see traces of Marc Rich in Paul Manafort, and Roger Stone, and Jeffrey Epstein, and Jared Kushner, and Eric Prince, and Donald Trump. Here is how Burton and the committee characterized the decision. Again, quoting Burton, a Republican. The pardons of Marc Rich and Pinky Green were the most controversial and most outrageous pardons issued by President Clinton, and likely by any president. Not anymore. Rich and Green were fugitives from justice and were two of the largest tax cheats in U.S. history. In addition, they had a long and disgraceful record of trading with America's enemies, helping prop up the Ayatollah Khomeini, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and the Russian mafia, among others. This track record has led even Marc Rich's lawyers to call him a traitor, quote, and observed that he has, quote, spit on the American flag, end quote. It is beyond any dispute that Marc Rich and Pinky Green did not deserve pardons. Therefore, the inevitable question is why the president granted them. End quote from Burton. Some of Marc Rich's vast fortune wound up in the hands of his ex-wife, Denise Rich, and through her to the Democratic Party, the Clinton Presidential Library Foundation, and the Senate campaign of Hillary Clinton. More found its way to Israel, where prominent government officials from across the political spectrum lobbied Bill Clinton on Rich's behalf. Still more was used to pay for fancy lawyers with fancier political connections. The optics were terrible. Whatever President Clinton's actual reasons for granting the pardon, it looked sketchy as all get out. And it reinforced the crooked Hillary narrative in 2016, when, a few days before the election, the FBI dumped a tranche of documents related to the Rich pardon. It's hard to find anyone in Washington of either party who supported the move. Democrats were outspoken in their disgust. Senator Chuck Schumer, quote, "There could be no justification in pardoning a fugitive from justice. Pardoning a fugitive stands our justice system on its head and makes a mockery of it," end quote. The precedent, by the way, for not pardoning fugitives dates back to the first Adams administration. Rep. Barney Frank, quote, "It was a real betrayal by Bill Clinton of all who had been strongly supportive of him to do something this unjustified. It was contemptuous," unquote. Representative Elijah Cummings, quote, "It's one thing to go to trial. It's one thing to stay here and face the music. It's one thing to be found not guilty. It's a whole other thing, in my opinion, when somebody, because they have the money, can go outside the country and evade the system. I tell you, it really concerns me because my constituents have a major problem with that, and I do too." Representative Henry Waxman, quote, "The Rich pardon is bad precedent. It appears to set a double standard for the wealthy and powerful, and it is an end run around the judicial process." Bill Clinton came to regret it too. Burton's committee, meanwhile, positively excoriated the move. Another quote here, long one. "President Clinton is ultimately responsible for the pardons and must ultimately provide an explanation of why he granted them. He has, however, failed to provide any satisfactory rationale for his actions. He has failed to answer any serious questions and instead has offered only one self-serving, factually inaccurate newspaper column to justify the pardons. President Clinton's attempted explanations have raised more questions than answers about his motivations for granting two of the most unjustified pardons in U.S. history. Regardless of the motivations for the rich and green pardons, the nation must live with the consequences of them. The pardons have sent two equally destructive messages. First, by granting the pardons, President Clinton undermined the efforts of U.S. law enforcement to apprehend figures abroad. By pardoning a man who evaded capture by the U.S. Marshal Service for almost 2 decades, President Clinton sent the message that indeed, crime can pay, and it must be worthwhile to remain a fugitive rather than face charges. The pardon also could undermine U.S. efforts to obtain extradition of fugitives from foreign countries. When a man like Rich can go from the Justice Department's most wanted to a free man with a stroke of the pen, it is difficult for the U.S. to credibly demand the extradition of wanted fugitives. Finally, the pardons send the message that President Clinton did believe that different rules applied to wealthy criminals. If he did not have the money to hire the well-connected attorney Jack Quinn and his White House access, Marc Rich never would have obtained a pardon. The president abused one of his most important powers, meant to free the unjustly convicted or provide forgiveness to those who have served their time and changed their lives. Instead, he offered it up to wealthy fugitives whose money had already enabled them to permanently escape American justice. Few other abuses could so thoroughly undermine public trust in government. End quote. Refreshing, isn't it, to remember that Republicans were once capable of moral clarity? Marc Rich was, without question, a loathsome human who did not deserve his pardon. But here's what Marc Rich didn't do. He didn't work with the Kremlin to help his preferred candidate win a presidential election. He didn't share voting data with a Russian intelligence officer who was his business partner. He didn't send Twitter DMs to Russian hackers. He didn't cozy up to Chinese fraudsters to fund his attempts to take down the government. He didn't monetize and politicize a pandemic that got 1 million Americans killed. He didn't disseminate known lies about stolen elections. He didn't champion insurrection. He wasn't a co-conspirator in one of the worst crimes ever perpetrated in this country. He didn't auction off pardons to the highest bidder. Bill Clinton pardoning Marc Rich was bad. Donald Trump pardoning Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, Mike Flynn, and his other cronies busted by Robert Mueller is orders of magnitude worse. Those pardons were categorically not, quote, meant to free the unjustly convicted or provide forgiveness to those who have served their time and changed their lives, Burton said. On the contrary, all of those men were emboldened by their pardons. Burton's committee was right about the Rich pardon, quote, undermined the efforts of U.S. law enforcement to apprehend fugitives abroad, end quote. By issuing pardons to his criminal pals, Trump undermined the efforts of U.S. law enforcement to enforce the law, period. Those pardons were a giant middle finger to the very concept of justice. Footnote. A little bit of irony. If there's one person who should have been infuriated at the Marc Rich pardon, and who should therefore fundamentally detest the prospect of the hard work of law enforcement going poof at the stroke of a corrupt president's pen, it is Rudolph W. Giuliani. After all, he was the federal prosecutor who indicted Rich in 1983. Anyway, those are just the most notable pardons. There are plenty of under-the-radar examples of Trump brazenly flaunting the spirit of the presidential pardon in ways that would have made Dan Burton lose his mind. On January 19th, 2021, the last day of his presidency, Donald Trump issued a flurry of pardons. Among the beneficiaries was Ken Kurson, a writer, editor, political consultant, and former punk musician. As pardon material, Kurson was an unorthodox choice. Typically, individuals who receive pardons distinguish themselves by putting the life of crime behind them, by expressing remorse, by giving back to the community, by visibly changing their lives for the better. These are supposed to be redemption stories. There's usually some well-placed senator, governor, or House representative lobbying for the pardon. Sometimes they've already served a big chunk of their prison term. Sometimes they've already been out of jail for years. Kurson was none of these things. He was under indictment for cyberstalking and harassment. The arrest warrant summarizes the nasty, vindictive behavior. And here I'm quoting, FBI special agents obtained information indicating that Kurson had used the mail, interactive computer services, electronic communication services, electronic communication systems of interstate commerce, and other facilities of interstate commerce to stalk and harass individual number 1, individual number 2, and individual number 3, collectively the victims, between approximately November and December 2015. During this time period, Kurson was engaged in divorce proceedings and blamed individual number 1, among others, for the dissolution of his marriage. As a result, beginning in or around November 2015, Kurson threatened to ruin individual number 1's reputation and engaged in a pattern of stalking and harassment against individual number 1. End quote. Now, there was no respected elder statesman sponsoring the push to free Kurson. It wasn't the hashtag. His case hadn't even gone to trial when he scored the pardon. Hadn't even gone to trial. So his victims were denied their day in court. And an acquittal was unlikely. The FBI had him dead to rights. But Kurson had an ace in the hole. He was close friends with Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. Kushner had hired Kurson to lead the New York Observer, the venerable and beloved Gotham periodical he bought and ruined. Kurson was also tight with Rudy Giuliani, with whom he co-authored a book and whose ill-fated 2008 presidential campaign he'd worked on. And he'd authored a speech for POTUS. In fact, it was Trump's decision to nominate him for a seat on the board of the National Endowment for Humanities and the subsequent FBI investigation that followed that dredged all this up. Kind of like what happened to Bernie Kerik, another beneficiary of a Trump pardon, after Bush II sought to nominate him to head Homeland Security. This means that Kurson was 1, in with Trump, the ultimate arbiter who got a pardon, 2, BFFs with Kushner, and 3, close to Giuliani. This is like George leaning on his friendship with Paul and his close working relationship with Ringo to score a pardon from John. Of course Kurson got the get-out-of-jail-free card, just like Kerik did. Charles Kushner, Jared's felon old man, got one too. This is egregiously corrupt, but it gets worse. Guess who was devoting his full attention to presidential pardons in January of 2021? This exchange is from the J6 committee hearing. Liz Cheney. Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign? Kushner says, I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if it happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to be just whining, to be honest with you, end quote. Then there is the revelation buried in the lawsuit last year against the odious Rudy Giuliani by his former employee, Noelle Dunphy. Here are the two relevant paragraphs. Paragraph 132. Giuliani also asked Ms. Dunphy if he knew anyone in need of a pardon, telling her that he was selling pardons for $2 million, which he and President Trump would split. He told Mrs. Dunphy that she could refer individuals seeking pardons to him so long as they did not go through, quote, the normal channels, end quote, of the Office of the Pardon Attorney, because correspondence going to that office would be subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. And here's another paragraph 119. To bolster his claims about the need to keep Ms. Dunphy's employment secret, that's in quotes, Giuliani told Ms. Dunphy about other schemes he undertook to reduce the amounts he owed to his ex-wife. For example, Giuliani told Ms. Dunphy that someone owed him $1 million, but Giuliani hinted that instead of having the money paid to him, he had his friend Robert Strick hold it for him. He said, quote, "Robert Strick just got me $1 million payment." This statement was recorded. Now, it may be that Giuliani was drunk out of his mind, making shit up to impress Dunphy. But if there's any truth to Rudy's bluster, and from what I've heard, this was not taken as a joke by the people around him, the scuttlebutt is that he was dead serious, selling pardons for $2 million a pop, while clearly not explicitly prohibited by Article 2, is pretty clearly a no-no. Remember, it was a crime akin to peddling pardons, attempting to sell off a Senate seat that took down former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. I can never say his name. Coincidentally, Blagojevich was 1, a member of Burton's committee, and 2, himself the recipient of a Trump pardon. One last note about Ken Kursan. He wasn't able to avoid further legal troubles. Just 7 months after scoring his pardon from Trump, he was arrested again. He subsequently pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanors related to his cyberstalking. Now, given what we know about Donald Trump's penchant for monetizing anything of value, his endorsement, his TV shows, the Washington hotel he illegally owned while in the White House, the documents he stole, as well as the specificity of Giuliani's instructions, there's little reason to believe Rudy was lying. Put it this way, if we find out that Trump really was selling pardons, would anyone be surprised? Nothing could be more on brand. 3+ years later, and this book came out in May of 2024. And in light of Noelle Dunphy's bombshell allegation, it is instructive to look back on the Trump pardons. Who got them? What they did to run afoul of the law, and in the case of his pardoned co-conspirators, what they've been up to since winning their freedom. Let's start with who Trump chose not to pardon. His personal attorney, Michael Cohen, who flipped on him, was not pardoned. Jeffrey Epstein was only in custody for 6 weeks before his death, so he never got a pardon. Ghislaine Maxwell was the beneficiary of a Trump well-wish, but not a pardon. Julian Assange was not pardoned. Edward Snowden was not pardoned. Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's chief who Mueller indicted, was not pardoned. Semyon Mogilevich was not pardoned. There are some lines, apparently, that even Trump dared not cross. We should also acknowledge, in the interest of fairness, that some of his pardons were completely justified. I question Trump's motives for pardoning the boxer Jack Johnson or the women's rights leader Susan B. Anthony, but it's for the good that they were formally pardoned. Michael Tedesco was already pardoned by President Obama, but a clerical error didn't absolve him of all his crimes. Trump fixed that. And free Lil Wayne. The individuals Trump did pardon, in the main, fall into several categories. Corrupt members of Congress, most of them Republicans, GOP political operatives, wealthy folks he or his family knew well or who donated big bucks to his campaign, war criminals, garrulous bootlicking sycophants, and co-conspirators in his various illicit enterprises, especially related to the 2016 election. So, let's go through. Corrupt members of Congress. Among the miscreants Trump pardoned were 7 former GOP congressmen. Chris Collins of New York, insider trading, lying to the FBI. Duncan Hunter of California, conspiracy, wire fraud, campaign finance violations. Texas's Steve Stockman, money laundering, misuse of campaign contributions. Rick Renzi of Arizona, corruption. North Carolina's Robin Hayes, lying to the FBI. Mark Sylvander of Michigan, obstruction of justice, acting as an unregistered foreign agent, indicted for money laundering. And perhaps the most brazenly corrupt of all, Duke Cunningham of California, bribery, fraud, tax evasion. By issuing the pardons to this motley gaggle of politician crooks, Trump was communicating that it's okay to run financial scams and break the law in other ways too, as long as you're a pro-Trump Republican. Hold that thought in your head, and then recall that in late 2020, early 2021, 6 MAGA Republicans, some of Trump's closest House allies, reportedly requested pardons from Trump. Mo Brooks, Matt Gaetz, Andy Biggs, Louis Gohmert, Scott Perry, and the bête noire of polite society, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Why would they make such a request? And why would Trump not honor it? GOP political operatives. On the list of Trump pardons are a number of Republican political operatives who had run afoul of the law. Elliot Broidy, a deputy RNC finance chairman during the Trump campaign, pleaded guilty to working as an unregistered foreign agent. He had, quote, sought to lobby the highest levels of the U.S. government to drop one of the largest fraud and money laundering prosecutions ever brought, unquote. It was involving the One Malaysia Development, a strategic investment and development company wholly owned by the government of Malaysia, and, quote, to deport a critic of the Chinese Communist Party, all the while concealing the foreign interest while doing whose bidding he was doing, end quote, according to a senior DOJ official. Again, DOJ's officials' words, not mine. Paul Erickson, famous for being the cuckolded boyfriend of Russian operative Maria Butina, was convicted of wire fraud and money laundering, bilking investors of over $1 million. What Trump called, quote, a minor financial crime. Jesse Benton, a longtime aide to both Ron and Rand Paul, and the husband of the former's granddaughter, was convicted of, quote, conspiring to solicit and cause an illegal campaign contribution by a foreign national, affecting a conduit contribution, and causing false records to be filed with the DNC, unquote, FEC, per the DOJ. So, he took money from Russia and diverted what he didn't take himself to Trump. Ed Henry, state chair of Trump's campaign in Alabama and a former lawmaker, was convicted of healthcare fraud. Dinesh D'Souza, the right-wing media figure best known for his big lie propaganda film 2000 Mules, was convicted of campaign finance fraud. All of these dudes got pardoned. Co-conspirators. Trump was loyal to those who showed him loyalty, gamely pardoning those convicted co-conspirators who did not turn on him. Paul Manafort, among many other treasonous things, gave election data to a Russian intelligence officer who specialized in election rigging. He left prison early because of COVID, then got a full pardon. He'd been pretty quiet since, until March of this past year, 2024, when Trump floated the idea of bringing him back to the campaign. George Papadopoulos has been busy promoting the book he wrote about his experience. Otherwise, he too has been pretty quiet. But not Steve Bannon. He's a fount of disinformation via his War Zone podcast. After the pardon, he was convicted of contempt of Congress. Anyway, and then he did actually go to jail for that. Had they not secured pardons from Trump, they didn't have to sweat it out until the last possible moment. Their pardons were prioritized. Roger Stone and Mike Flynn may have been in prison in January 2021 instead of in the thick of the insurrection activity. Pardoning Roger Stone is like fertilizing a tumor. Pardoning General Flynn is like freeing General Zod. No good can possibly come of it. There's also Sheriff Joe Arpaio and Trump's well-heeled pal Conrad Black and the art dealer Heli Namad, who ran an illegal gambling operation at Trump Tower. Taken together. Now, this is a long list. I'm already at the 28-minute mark here. These are the kind of people a president of Russia or Belarus or Uzbekistan might pardon. The takeaway is obvious. If you go to bat for Trump, don't worry about prison. He's got your back. How can his indicted manservant, Waltine Nauta, look at all the Trump pardonees and not rest assured that his employer and protector will pardon him, too, if Trump winds up getting another term? Again, I wrote this in May. This came out May of 2024. Should F. POTUS become POTUS, he has promised to pardon the worst of the worst, including anyone convicted of crimes related to January 6th. Every Capitol besieger, including the leaders of the Proud Boys, who were convicted of seditious conspiracy and received long prison sentences, will be set free with zero incentive not to exact revenge. Which is why I'm reading this now, because it has happened, just like he said. The Constitution is vague on the subject, but presidential pardons are intended to correct errors or to show mercy, not to reward sycophants for their loyalty, and certainly not to obstruct justice. It is also strongly implied that a president cannot pardon himself. But then, the founders assumed the chief executive would not himself be a criminal.